whether or not they're in the same group as I am. It might be, I have brown hair. Does that person have brown hair? Yes or no? I'm female. I'm American. Is this person in my group or not? And a lot of the ways in which social science research shows that we use technology, in some respects, those social group categories lead us to have a lot of negative interactions with people, because sometimes the most salient thing when interacting online, on Facebook or Twitter, is the things you don't agree about, the things that are different about you. But we try to look at, well, how can you maximize this technology and use it as a mediator to encourage peaceful interactions? And so that's what we've been looking at. We largely use big data. A lot of our research has looked at social media. So one of our older, but I think my favorite example of what we've done is Facebook's Peace Dot page. And if you go to the Peace Dot page, what it does is it tracks the number of friends made from people from these different social categories. So it'll track things like the number of Israeli and Palestinian friends made within a 24-hour period. I believe it's also got people from India and Pakistan and one or two others. And we've tracked over time like conflict in those regions as well as friendships in those regions. And my favorite statistic there is, and hang on, I gotta just scroll down so that I get it right. But on the worst day of conflict between Israel and Palestine, there were still 13 times as many Facebook friends made during that same period. And well, you know, Facebook friend is a click on a computer, and it's not, you know, face-to-face warfare, but it's something, and it's a way that people have connected. And so we spend a lot of time discussing how the technologies we use to interact affect us. We question whether or not they're good for society and how we can make them better, and in general focusing on that kind of mutual benefit over and above the cost of any business transaction. So that's kind of really broad strokes of what we do. I can still talk more about it in detail. I've got lots of other notes, but I really wanted to hear from you guys and hear more about what you do and your thoughts and any questions.
I would have to say I would resonate with a lot of what you said. I think in our project with Michael Namkung that we're building this wall of song, we're interested in using technology to amplify our face-to-face connections more than anything else, and that felt experience as being the holy grail, if you like. Right. So when we launched the project in Washington, D.C., well, just to briefly go back, the way that our project works is you record yourself singing individually, and then we layer these voices together into an ever-evolving choir that is you know, presented back to the community. And we launched it in Washington, D.C. and the San Jose ICA, but it was in Washington where we felt outside the payback of that felt experience. And I think that was where when we blasted the sound off the rooftops, people coming out of the metro thought there was an uprising above them, people in their houses thought there was an uprising in the metro. We were kind of overwhelmed by those emotional responses. So I think that's the thrust of what we're trying to use technology to amplify those effects.
Right, right. And I think that's a really good point, in that one of the things we look at is it's really using our devices, so our phones, as the mediating technology that connects us to people in our face-to-face world. So it's not necessarily always going to be online interaction, but you know, when you use Airbnb to book someone's house or to rent their room, you have this opportunity to meet somebody who is maybe completely different from you, and that technology is what brings us together. And so we've been trying to figure out how to maximize the positive aspects of those interactions, and how to assess it, and then how to kind of generalize it as well.
How do you do that? So how do you assess it, maximize it?
So that's something we are still defining at this point, but a lot of it is recording various aspects of the interaction. So for instance, you know, let's go back to the Uber example. You know, not only do our devices set up that interaction, but they also assess different parts of the interaction. So we could use the GPSs on our phones, for instance, to measure how close two people are to one another when they're talking, because social science research shows that when you're having a conversation with somebody, one way you can tell whether or not it's going well is by physical proximity. So when you get closer to somebody, that means things are going well. So we've got this opportunity to not only assess things like how people talk to one another on social media, what kinds of friends people are making in social media. We can also use our devices to assess kind of like the geographical aspects as well. And right now what we're trying to do is kind of model these interactions between dyads, so person A and person B come together because of some business opportunity, say they need a room on BDR or something. And what happens during that interaction that we can assess and determine whether or not it actually maximizes their beneficial engagement. So we can look at things like GPS sensing data, we can look at any written communication that happens before they meet, we can look at online reviews after the fact, so there's a number of different ways that we can assess this. Yeah. Other thoughts?
It reminds me of this this project based in Philadelphia called the Conflict Kitchen, where every certain period there's a specific cuisine from like a stated enemy of the U.S.
So like it's a place that we're in conflict with?
Yes. So one time like Cuba or Iran, or Afghanistan, I think. And so there's several menus that are put together, and then a chef comes together and with the community, cooks for the community, and then there's these conversations that happen around that. And there's always the publications based on conversations that happen over that food, and also stories from those communities. And it's a very different kind of technology, right?
Right.
Food is technology.
Well, I think I would argue it is, because it's a human innovation, right?
Yes, for sure. But it's a very different kind of, like, there isn't any measurement of what kind of outcomes this allows for. So I don't think there's a stated like goal of peace, but it's called Conflict Kitchen. So there's something about that relationship with peace. I don't know how that is addressed at the level.
So we have basically this model, and I didn't want to go into all of the great nuances, but we actually do talk about that, and that there are kind of different levels of peace. So the first kind of level of peace is just to try to end conflict, and so the Conflict Kitchen might be at that level of peace, in that it's bringing, exposing people to something new that they may have a negative opinion about, and research shows often if we see ourselves in conflict, especially against people who are in groups outside our own, just having that contact will help increase it. So I think actually that it'd be really interesting to figure out a way to assess whether or not exposure to the Conflict Kitchen, eating those meals, actually makes people more open-minded towards the particular countries, or open-minded in general about the countries that are vilified by ours sometimes for good cause, sometimes not so much.
It's a really fascinating example. Do you know anything more about what brought people together at the kitchen at that particular instance? I'm really interested in the idea that maybe people who are more mindful, you're basically selecting for people who have already bought into the concept. I'm really interested in how do you get people who are actually vehemently in conflict with each other to the table.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that particular experience was designed to address that, but I'd be curious if you would.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's one thing to have someone who's, yes, I want to go taste something.
The food is good.
Yeah. We can all agree on
that.
So you would.
I haven't experienced it, but I know about the project, and it's really a wonderful project. I think in part there's an interesting tension between the measuring that you guys are doing, which is really important, but also this idea that we as artists are trying to make space for creative tension holding, and that the Conflict Kitchen really does that. It allows for people, so it's not necessarily a very clear cut when is it positive or negative, it's holding those in tension, that sort of maybe the power behind the poetic gesture for us as artists. I think that you talked about software being like that, where you can allow for these really opposing and difficult views to come together. And that's not my phrase, I should say, that's Parker Palmer. He's a Quaker writer, and I think it just really shows, it calls it standing in the tragic gap, where you can have different opposing views and use that tension to become creative energy. So somehow figuring out if you can combine that measuring with the creative tension would be pretty powerful.
I think that you possibly could. So so I've got a colleague at UT Dallas, actually. Her name is Extine Burrow, and she is a new media artist. And one of the things I find most fascinating about what she does is she uses Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is a popular data collection software site for us social scientists. She uses it for her art, and so she'll have people do tasks on MTurk, and then she uses their stories that they create as her exhibits. It's fascinating stuff. And so we've been actually working on kind of quantifying and analyzing and understanding what kinds of themes we're seeing. So I think you could. It would require some creativity, which academics and artists, and those aren't mutually exclusive, but we're good at that.
So I can really relate to your, what was the phrase?
Creative tension holding.
Creative tension holding, that's great. So, you know, some of you may know of a game design collective called Mole Industria, or better known by the leader of it is Paolo Pedricini, but he's kind of a provocateur. He makes games that are sort of quite radical and in his own language, that they serve purposes other than just entertainment. And he has this provocative phrase of saying, you know, if you can measure it, I'm not interested in that. If you can measure it, I'm not interested in that change, right? And that was a critique. It's kind of a provocative critique that he told sort of like a large room theater of folks that are there, really sort of believing and invested in the field of making games for change, right? So what are games for change? It's this notion that we can sort of like, understand games, understand sort of all these schema for incentivizing people to engage in certain activities. Thinking of games as these interesting rehearsal spaces for learning and for rehearsal spaces. And beyond that, in that room, we're all sort of really interested in this holy grail of the notion that games can themselves not just be this thing, this cultural thing that helps us maybe, perhaps empathize with someone or understand some situation, or learn some situation, experience an artistic experience, but also can the game itself generate change? Can the activity of being playing and being engaged, can that generate positive change? Can it? And then what? And then how? How do you know that it's creating it? How do you measure it? And so I'm not really going to end with one way or the other here. I'm just saying that there's terrifically entertaining and exciting and dangerous tension in that notion.
I'm really interested in your empathy mirror project in that regard, because I don't want to, because that's the project you're working on, right?
Yes.
That seems to be where the measuring potentially could feed into this idea of creative tension holding.
Mm-hmm.
Where I'll let you speak for it, because I don't. But I have something I think.
Right, and I appreciate you mentioning the creative tension, because I think that's the direction that we would like to go in. So if I might, I just might spend just a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit more about this project that we're working on. It's called the Empathy Mirror, and it's a way for us to explore this concept of empathy in a much more, in its entire complexity. And the start of this project was a group of us. It's an interdisciplinary group of scientists, engineers, artists, and designers, reflecting on our own meanings of what empathy means. And the goal of this project is to create an art installation where we hope to inspire others to do the same, to reflect on your own meanings of empathy. The other part that we would like to explore with this is to really provoke a broader discussion of the impacts of empathy and understanding that empathy can be used in both positive and negative ways for society. And so let me start with telling you a little bit about my own perspective of empathy and to tell you the motivations of what drive this work, and then I think I would love to hear your perspective on this. So I'm trained as a biochemist, but I work with designers now at the Center for Design Research at Stanford. And the word empathy comes up a lot when you work with designers. And what was perplexing to me is that I had a hard time understanding what they meant by it. And inevitably, when you talk to designers, and if you ask them, what does empathy mean, you get different responses. So, you know, oftentimes when you ask people to define it, a common definition is, oh, it's the ability to walk in another person's shoes. I think probably people here have heard that a lot. I mean, it's the ability to understand another person's perspective. You can ask other people, and they might say that, oh, empathy is really about compassion, you know, being able to feel someone else's pain or joy. Can you really have an emotional connection? And at the Center for Design Research, there's yet another type of empathy that we talk a lot about, which is active empathy, which is this notion that, yeah, can you sense how another person is feeling, but then can you go one step further and act on that in a positive way that results in a positive engagement amongst the team itself. So it's both sensing and acting and the ability to do so. So that to me is really interesting, the fact that empathy has these different interpretations. And for us, getting back to the empathy mirror, we were brought together at a National Academies conference. It's like I said, you know, a bunch of artists, engineers, designers, and scientists. And our team, which was brought together, we didn't know each other, we were given a prompt. And the prompt had something to do with basically how do we create technologies that are human-centric and that don't result in isolation. And so this is a really interesting question, right? Because there's no question that technology brings us together and it allows us to collaborate more effectively. So let's acknowledge that's true. But the other side of that, which was really interesting for us to explore, is some of the negative consequences, and particularly this notion of the echo chamber, technology's role in creating an echo chamber. And we were talking and developing this way before the election happened, but we see, I think, a direct consequence of the echo chamber being, you know, fake news, for example, and what allows that to thrive and exist. And so this notion that technology can be used in a way that we basically surround ourselves with people, ideas, information, and news that basically reaffirms our own beliefs this is a type of emotional empathy. This is you know, research that's done in cognitive and behavioral sciences, and that there is this type of empathy called emotional empathy, that you get this feeling of connection when you can relate to people who think like you. And so what's really interesting for us is to sort of break that down, right? Is to say that just because you agree with one another doesn't necessarily mean that you're right. So a perfect example of this is if you have two people who are lacking in information and knowledge, but they agree with each other, all that means is that they agree with each other, not that they're correct. So we're really interested in exploring those nuances. And so, and that's why some psychologists argue that empathy is actually not a good thing. This type of emotional empathy sort of creates this echo chamber effect. And it doesn't allow people to be rational in decision making in light of facts that are presented. The other type of empathy that is really interesting for us to examine in our work is this other type of empathy that psychologists call cognitive empathy, which is the ability to understand another person's point of view. This is the idea that can you relate to my perspective? You know, we don't have to agree with each other's point of view, but can we understand my perspective, or can we understand each other's perspective that allows us to cooperate with each other and get along in group settings and things like that. So you can imagine that there's different ways that this notion of empathy, which is generally this catch-all for meaning compassion and understanding, that it's actually might be beneficial to sort of unpack it in different ways. And let me give you a concrete example of why I think this is important, where it resonates with me. So one of the biases that we have in the scientific community is that if we give the public more information, then that will be enough to change people's view. And a really classic example of this is climate change, right? So if you give people more data about climate change, then non-believers will become believers. But one of our blind spots, if you will, in the scientific community is that we don't account for the notion of confirmation bias. And this has been well studied in the psychology, cognitive, and behavioral literature, which is the idea is that if you have a belief, and I give you more information, you're going to filter out those facts that agree with your own opinion, and you're going to filter out. You're going to take in the facts that agree with your own opinion, filter out the ones that don't. And so there's a very strong emotional empathy happening there. And again, we feel like this is really connected to this idea of the echo chamber. And for us, what we're really interested in exploring with this exhibit is that if we know that there's this bridge that needs to be crossed between people's opinion and moving them towards perhaps an understanding of a new point of view or a new way of thinking, that there's this bridge that needs to be crossed. And I think it's pretty clear that scientific evidence and facts doesn't necessarily help in that bridge. And that's why in the scientific community we haven't been very successful in making that argument. But what we're doing with this exhibit is I think that art and technology are paths and really great opportunities to create that bridge between emotional and cognitive empathy. You know, I can talk to you a little bit more about the exhibit itself, but it's definitely a work in progress. But for us, these are the concepts that we're trying to wrap our heads around, and as an interdisciplinary group, come up with ways to express them.
I had never thought about different kinds of empathy, and that's really fascinating. What I got from your project as well that was so interesting was this, correct me if I'm wrong, is this idea that if you see your own brain patterns of empathy, and you can visualize that, and the viewers see people see that, it actually encourages more empathy. Is that right? Is there something that seeing that sort of the neurofeedback loop, I think, of looking at the empathy helps to impact and increase it. I guess I'm just wondering if that's a connection between measuring and if so we can identify. So I'll just share why I think this is relevant. So. In our project, we've been fascinated to discover that when we sing actually together, we have these physiological benefits that happen. Our so-called bonding hormones are triggered, endorphins, lowers cortisol, and it even synchronizes our heartbeats. Apparently, we literally form a unified heartbeat and our heart rates slow down. So this seems pretty important to amplify if we could figure out how to do that. And I wonder if there's something to be said with your empathy mirror. What if we could visualize as we were singing together our heartbeats? It even sounds a little cheesy, but coming together, would that further emphasize or increase that kind of reaction? Would that build upon it?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating idea. I haven't done those experiments, but I wonder if that might actually encourage that emotional empathy category. And so the fact that we have this, I think that the evidence is pretty clear that emotional empathy, the reason why it's so powerful is that there is this physiological response, this bonding connection that results when, oh, I agree with you, or I can relate to you. And that's great for developing social interactions and really important for the human experience, obviously. And I think that the flip side to that, of course, is just because you bond with someone and relate to them, again, does not necessarily mean that you're actually correct in the context of sort of a larger societal question. And so that was one of the things that we're interested in delving into. But I am interested in this idea of how do you get people to reflect on their own confirmation biases. And I'm wondering if the brain imaging is one way of provoking that.
For me, it's totally shattering that, and not trying to say that there is like one kind of one thing that is true, one thing that is wrong. But there's a lot of I mean, in the specific context of my work, where I'm dealing with Lebanese history, which is totally contested. There's like over 100 political parties in Lebanon, so 100 active political parties. Each has its own different version of what happened since independence. So since 1943, we have like it's an official problem. We have a history textbook problem. We don't know how to tell our history. So what I've been trying to do is create this software using artificial intelligence to sift through an oral history archive of people's daily memories and try to come up with many different versions. So keep remixing many versions of what had happened based on people's like lived realities or their memories of these lived realities. And so I'm not even trying to say there is one truth or there is one thing that is right, but rather it's more of what happens if we listen to each other, and would we kind of get to some kind of imagined history where we can have a conversation on how to disagree. I don't want to agree, but I want to have a common language of how to disagree. So that's the kind of problem that I'm.
Well, and I like what you're doing a lot because I think sometimes people get stuck in this notion that there's only one right answer, there's only one way. But in fact, you know, the five of us here could watch a car accident in front of us and we'd have 5 different memories of what happened. You know, everyone has their own unique perspective, and I think that tying that back into the discussion of fake news and empathy and these silos that we're seeing online, is that I think that we run this risk of shrinking who we're connecting with through mediated technologies to only cherry pick the people who are going to confirm the things that we believe and are more similar to us than different, and aren't going to expand our viewpoints or make us more empathetic. And that's one of my biggest worries about technology, is that it connects us, but it also limits our scope and our full potential in a way that is potentially dangerous because it's pushing us into these kind of homogenous groups.
Some of this is reminding me too of one of the things that I've studied and practiced a bit in sort of, again, trying to make these kinds of games that I'm interested in, these kinds of interactive experiences. I've looked up quite a bit at Theater of the Oppressed by Augusto Boal, and he has very specific and very interesting viewpoints on empathy, right? And so he pushes back on traditional Aristotelian theater, where you go through the hero's journey, you come to understand their flaw, you come to understand that they understand their flaw, and that they're going to hit hard, they're going to hit and crash, and you are with them, right? Because you identify, because everything about the craft of the stage, the craft of theater, and the craft of acting is so that you can identify and empathize with this character, and therefore you are experiencing it. And then, of course, the climax, the fall, and the catharsis. But that, he argues, is extremely disempowering. You did not really experience that. It was a fake catharsis that in actuality probably substitutes real action, because now you feel like you've been through it, right? So I think one of the potential problems about mediation, and by the way, this is, again, how you define, depending on how you want to define technology, is theater and technology, it could be, but really at the core is storytelling, and is that a technology? So storytelling itself could distance us from each other. It can create a fake or a kind of delusional sort of distancing, is Boal's argument. And I think that we don't need what today we consider technology for that danger to exist.
Right.
And so, but how do we get, so, I'm an artist, and I do care deeply about representational media, and I don't want to live my life hating myself, right? So I believe in it, right? There are problems with it. There are, are we creating this delusional sort of empathy and so forth? But so I think that it's not this neither or mentality, right? It's a multiplicity of sort of perspectives and of dialogue. The best that we can do is really come to the table and have dialogue. And then how do we get sort of people, whether you call them players or you call them viewers or users, to engage deliberately in this conversation and learn from each other? And how do they get to practice their theories and deliberate their theories through this interaction? And the bridge. So the bridge is really interesting between personal opinion and new perspective. For me, I often care and think about when I think about my designs, I often really, really care about, okay, empathy can be really sort of like storytelling to sort of get at this notion of emotional empathy, usually. It's very, very important. But you can't just abandon the player there, or the viewer, or you can't. What are you now going to, where's the bridge to some sort of actionable action? I've primed them, maybe they're primed to care about something. Is there something that now they can do that will have a positive effect, that it's in dialogue to the real world? We didn't just abandon them, and they don't feel the sense of fake catharsis.
Well, I think that within the social science literature on video games, there is a fair amount of evidence that video games do serve some of these purposes that you discussed. So we can learn new skills in video games. We can, playing video games changes our expectations. This is the idea. Changes our expectations about what kind of careers we have. So you have somebody role play a specific career, and I think they're much more likely to have that career later on. So what we do in games does have an impact on our real lives. But I think that whole literature has been misdirected and focused on aggression. When I'm not sure that's the interesting question. I mean, that's a worry and a concern and whatnot, but games provide us with experiences that, as you said, are akin to real life. And are they replacing our real life? Are they enhancing what's going on in our real life? And is that good for our society? These are things that I think about.
Yeah, So I'm intrigued by this notion of how do you get to the state where we agree to disagree, which is, I think, is kind of what you were alluding to, and this creative, what you call the creative tension, where you allow both positive and negative points of view to coexist. And I don't know if either of you want to expand more on that, because I think that's, for me, a huge motivator to explore this concept of empathy.
I think that it's a tremendously important question. I know in Michael and I's our individual and collaborative practices idea, we call it radical ambivalence. You guys talk about ambivalence. Artists talk about ambivalence. And this idea that poetry and song is a kind of a sung poetry in a way, is a way to bypass the problems of language almost right away, and the problems, like to come at it in the back door, if you like, so even the song, think about Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, it's full of paradox and praise and lamentation. It's the holy or the broken, hallelujah. So it allows you to sort of have these bonding, uplifting, and generative experiences with people you may or may not agree with, that hold ambivalence and creative tension holding, make space for it, like poetry does, and other art experiences, like software might do.
Depending on the context and how it's kind of coming back to the previous panel on intention and like what is the context that these different projects are, what are the contexts that they exist within, what's the intention, how is the medium affecting the end result. So we're talking about like storytelling could be very could create some kind of fake catharsis. So that specific medium needs to be paid attention to. Software, music, some kind of, I keep thinking there is an actual mirror of
That's how this project started. We actually were going the direction of, so the reason why it was called the empathy mirror, there's two reasons. One is the metaphorical, reflecting on your own notion of empathy, but our original concept for this project was to create this immersive experience where you would see, feel, and hear another person's perspective. And the idea was to create this physical mirror where you would look into it and see another person rather than yourself. That you would hear words being said that you would never say but in your own voice, but then also feel another person's point of view through haptics and these type of things. And an experience that you normally wouldn't experience. And so that was our original idea of this empathy mirror, was to create this immersive experience. And we've kind of sort of generated different ideas based on that, and we're actually going into a slightly different direction, which is to create more of an interactive experience. And the idea of that is, again, to hopefully inspire and provoke people to reflect on their own confirmation biases and explore sort of more the complex terrain that this word entails, and again, to do that through art and technology.
So you were trying to make strange days?
I'm sorry?
You were trying to make strange days.
I don't know what that is.
It's a movie. It's totally, I totally agree with your comment. You need to watch Strange Days. Okay. So one of the things I was thinking about when you were describing what you're doing with the empathy mirror is, oh crap, I totally lost my train of thought. The downside of like having an unstructured conversation. But I was linking it to what we've been doing at PIL, and Yeah, I lost it. I'll remember it like 5 minutes after we're done. I'm sorry, let me turn it to anybody else. And I believe we are starting to get close to the end of our session, and I don't know if there's anyone in the audience who has questions for us. Yes.
It is a rare and beautiful thing to see an all-woman panel.
Yes!
It's not a question, it's a statement.
I meant for that to be my first comment.
Yeah.
What an honor
I'm
and
blown
how happy I
away.
am.
I'm so
Thank you.
thrilled.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been to more kinds of things like this. I actually sort of know you, Susana, through VR stuff. But anyway, that was sort of my question related to empathy. Are any of you, besides Susana, because I know, exploring augmented or virtual reality as a tool in your artwork or scientific work or computer-related work? And I know Susana could speak to it because, to me, has the potential to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And I've seen a lot of the most recent projects that involve it. Like, you can experience what it's like to be in solitary confinement, experience what it's like to be a handicapped person or blind, or so for example, in your peace project, I think you can be a resident, right? Resident artist or
Right.
Something like that. And it's gender for this term, right? So maybe creating projects, how does it feel to be a man versus a woman walking down the street, that kind of thing. So if anybody could speak to that. And thank you for today.
Thank you. Does anybody on the panel? I have a comment, but I don't want to monopolize.
I'll just say that VR is one of the technologies that we looked into in developing this project. And in my conversations with people who, so first of all, there is a lot of empathy work being done in this, in the sense of, can virtual reality, that immersive experience, promote empathy? And so because there's, I think, a fair amount of activity in this area, we decided not to go down that route. But one of the interesting conversations I had was with folks in Los Angeles who are some of the pioneers in virtual reality. And I asked them specifically this question is, you know, can virtual reality really promote empathy? And I've tried those Oculus Rift goggles before, so I feel how powerful that is and how it really blocks out any externality that you really are experiencing the moment. So I do have a sense of how powerful it can be. And he brought up an interesting point, which is he had a slightly negative, I think, perspective on that, which was interesting as someone who's been a pioneer in this technology. He said that, again, it sort of is good at tugging at this emotional empathy component. So for example, you know, if you have this immersive experience where you see the experience of a Syrian refugee camp, right? It's like, oh, like you're there, you see those circumstances, but can you actually really understand what it's like to be in a Syrian refugee camp? Obviously not, because you actually haven't lived that experience. So there is perhaps this limitation of, yes, you can maybe appreciate, and maybe that will lead you to act in the sense of making donations and caring about it, but can you actually truly understand what it's like to be there? Probably not. And so it was just interesting to talk to him about sort of the possibilities and limits of VR in that regard.
If I may. Yes. So, I think perhaps, you also, did you see the recent article maybe in The Guardian by
I don't know, you have to see a little bit more.
Okay, sorry. Yes, this notion that, you know, how ridiculous is it that you can empathize with Syrian refugees, you know, because you put a headset on for 10 minutes, right? And we can go, and I, you know, because complex argument, right? Complex argument, but in part it's because, of course, you're not, their interiority, you may be feeling the space much more, and yes, it's about it's incremental, right? It might be a lot more sort of powerful and helpful than reading a text or reading a New York Times article about it or what have you. But it doesn't approach, nor should you think that it's approach having the anxiety, the fear, their lack of control, the lack of being able to put a pause on that experience, right? And it's very dangerous to think that it approaches that, right? Now, flip side, as an artist, I can't feel paralyzed by that danger. And I don't know what to do with that. And I need to I wrestle with it because I can't feel paralyzed. I have to, and I'm driven to, and it's my life's mission to create this kind of work. And owning it can be hard. Owning it can be hard because oftentimes in sort of game designers love to talk about how it's low stakes. Games are rehearsal spaces it's the rehearsal for the revolution. It's the rehearsal for something else, right? It's not, and it's a safe space because of that, and failure is safe. And granted, that's incredibly, that's a power of games, right? That being able to do that safely. But in the kinds of games that I'm interested in, games, experiences, it can be high stakes. You are talking about lived experiences. You are talking about folks that, who are experiencing this or who historically experienced it. It can be high stakes. So I have no clear answer to that. I think that's an incredibly important question for folks that are doing this kind of work. And there's no question that it's hit the documentary filmmaking community big, VR, right? So I'm glad about that because the documentary filmmaking community has wrestled with this for a good chunk of 7 decades, and we can learn from them, right? Technologists and game designers can learn about how they wrestle with these issues of burden of responsibility and ethics. So,
can I interject really quickly? I know we
And
need to
then
wrap
last,
up. I just want to say that the idea of empathy, I'm concerned a little bit about empathy fatigue with VR a little bit. So then this idea that we could, if we don't feed back into our face-to-face experience, if we're just having that experience but not actually in a kind of felt experience situation where we can't reconnect back in some meaningful way, does that become a form of kind of to have the opposite effect?
That's a good point, and it might actually make us desensitized to situations in which people in our real physical environments need our assistance and our empathy.
as we struggle to be more empathetic, we become
Right.
less.
I do want to invite people
Guys,
to
I gotta
sing.
wrap it up. I'm sorry.
I know we're about to wrap up, and I wanted
Yeah.
to let people know that we're singing to here tonight at 5 p.m. And I wanted to just invite you all to become vulnerable and lift our voices together.
Okay, so